The autumn wind carried the scent of burning sage across the Thompson ranch as Maria Santos clutched the letter that would change everything. Her weathered hands trembled as she approached the main house where Samuel Thompson sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. The 40-year-old rancher had built his spread from nothing, earning respect from every cowhand and neighbor for 3 counties around. Maria had worked as the ranch cook for 15 years, ever since her husband died in a mining accident. Samuel had given her a home when she had nowhere else to turn, and her son, Diego, had grown up alongside the ranch hands, learning to rope and ride with the best of them. Now 25, Diego worked as Samuel's most trusted foreman, never knowing the secret that had haunted Maria every single day. The letter had arrived that morning from Santa Fe, bearing news that made Maria's blood run cold. Her brother Carlos had finally found her after all these years of searching. The letter was brief but threatening. He knew where she was, knew about Diego, and he was coming to collect what he believed was rightfully his. Maria understood the implication perfectly. Carlos had gambling debts, and he saw Diego as a way to solve his problems. Samuel noticed Maria approaching and immediately sensed something was wrong. Her usually steady demeanor seemed shattered, and she kept glancing toward the horizon as if expecting trouble to appear at any moment. When she reached the porch steps, she stopped and looked up at him with desperate eyes. "Mr. Thompson, I need to tell you something," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But please, I'm begging you, don't reveal what I'm about to say to anyone, especially not Diego." Samuel set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, concerned by the fear he saw in her face. Maria had always been the strongest person he knew, keeping the ranch hands fed and the household running smoothly even during the hardest winters. Seeing her this frightened made his stomach tighten with worry. She handed him the letter with shaking hands. "My brother Carlos is coming here. He's dangerous, Mr. Thompson. He's been looking for us for years, and now he's found us." Her voice cracked as she continued. "There's something about Diego that you don't know. Something I should have told you long ago." Samuel opened the letter and read Carlos Santos's crude handwriting. The man demanded that Maria bring Diego to Santa Fe within 2 weeks, or he would come to the ranch and take him by force. The letter mentioned debts owed to very dangerous people, people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone who got in their way. "What is it about Diego that I don't know?" Samuel asked gently, though he could see the answer was tearing Maria apart. Maria took a deep breath and began to tell him the story she had kept buried for 25 years. Diego wasn't her son by birth. When he was just a baby, his real parents had been killed by Apache raiders near the Mexican border. Maria and her husband had found the child crying in the ruins of a burned wagon train. The baby's parents were clearly wealthy people, probably traveling with money and valuables that the raiders had taken. She and her husband had taken the child in, raising him as their own when no other family could be found. But Carlos had been there that day too, and he had always believed the child's parents must have hidden treasure somewhere. He had spent years trying to force Maria to tell him where the family's wealth might be buried, never accepting that there was no hidden fortune. Now Carlos was desperate enough to take Diego and use him as leverage against anyone who might know the truth about the child's heritage. Maria feared that Carlos would hurt or even kill Diego if he couldn't get the answers he wanted. Worse yet, Carlos had connections to outlaws and rustlers who would think nothing of terrorizing an entire ranch to get what they wanted. "I've been running from this my whole life," Maria whispered. "I thought if we came far enough north, if we stayed quiet and worked hard, Carlos would never find us. But he has friends everywhere, people who owe him favors or fear him. He's not the kind of man who gives up." Samuel stood up from his chair and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the land he had worked so hard to build. The ranch was home to 30 cowboys and their families, good people who depended on him for their livelihoods. The thought of danger coming to his land made his jaw clench with anger. But the thought of anything happening to Diego or Maria made his heart ache. Diego had become like a son to him over the years. The young man's natural skill with horses and cattle, his easy laugh, and his fierce loyalty had earned him respect from every hand on the ranch. Samuel had often thought about what would happen to the spread when he got older, and he had always imagined Diego taking over the day-to-day operations. "Does Diego know any of this?" Samuel asked, turning back to face Maria. She shook her head, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I never told him. He thinks my husband was his real father. I couldn't bear to tell him the truth about how his parents died. He's been so happy here, so at peace. I didn't want him to spend his life wondering about people he'll never know." Samuel walked back to Maria and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out," he said firmly. "Carlos isn't taking Diego anywhere, and he's not bringing trouble to this ranch, but I need to know everything about this man. What kind of people is he involved with? How dangerous are we talking about?" Maria wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. She told Samuel about Carlos's gambling addiction, his involvement with cattle rustlers and claim jumpers, and his reputation for violence when he didn't get his way. She had heard rumors that he owed money to a gang based out of Wyoming, men who were known for their brutality in collecting debts. "He's not stupid, Mr. Thompson," she warned. "He knows this ranch has value, and he knows you've built something worth protecting. If he can't get what he wants from Diego, he might try to force you to pay him money to leave us alone. Men like Carlos see honest people as easy targets." Samuel's expression hardened as he listened. He had built his ranch through honest work and fair dealing. But the frontier was still a dangerous place where men like Carlos could bring violence to peaceful communities. He had dealt with rustlers and troublemakers before, but this felt different. This was personal, and it threatened the people he cared about most. "How long do we have?" he asked. "The letter says 2 weeks, but knowing Carlos, he might not wait that long. He's probably already on his way here, maybe bringing some of his outlaw friends with him." Maria looked toward the horizon again, her fear evident in every line of her face. Samuel made a decision that would change everything for everyone on the ranch. "We're not running, and we're not giving in to threats. This is our home, and Carlos Santos doesn't get to take that away from us. But Maria, I need you to promise me something." She looked up at him with hope, beginning to replace the fear in her eyes. "Promise me you'll trust me to handle this the right way. I know you're scared, but I've been protecting this land and these people for 20 years. I won't let anything happen to you or Diego, but you have to let me do what needs to be done." Maria nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders for the first time in years. Samuel Thompson was a man of his word, and if anyone could stand up to Carlos and his threats, it would be him. But she still feared what the confrontation might cost them all. As the sun set completely and the first stars appeared in the Montana sky, neither of them knew that Diego was walking back from the horse corrals and had overheard enough of their conversation to understand that his whole life was about to change. Hidden in the shadows near the porch, he had learned the truth about his origins and the danger that was coming for them all. The next morning would bring new challenges as Samuel began preparing the ranch for trouble. But tonight, Maria finally felt like she wasn't carrying her burden alone anymore. The rancher had given her his word, and that meant more to her than any promise she had ever received. The morning after Maria's confession, Samuel Thompson stood in his barn before dawn, methodically checking weapons and ammunition while his mind raced through possible plans. He had spent most of the night thinking about Carlos Santos and the threat heading toward his ranch. The autumn air was crisp and still, but Samuel could feel a storm coming that had nothing to do with the weather. Diego appeared in the barn doorway just as Samuel was examining his rifle. The young foreman's face was grim, and Samuel immediately knew that Diego had overheard more of the previous evening's conversation than Maria realized. "You heard us talking last night," Samuel said quietly. not making it a question. Diego nodded and stepped into the barn, closing the door behind him. I heard enough to know that Maria isn't my real mother, and that some man named Carlos is coming here to cause trouble. I heard enough to know my whole life has been a lie. The pain in Diego's voice made Samuel set down his rifle and turn to face the young man he had come to love like a son. Diego's hands were clenched into fists, and his dark eyes burned with a mixture of anger, confusion, and hurt that cut Samuel to the core. Your life hasn't been a lie, son. Maria loves you more than anything in this world. She and her husband saved you when you were just a baby, and she's protected you every day since then. The fact that you weren't born to her doesn't change what kind of mother she's been to you. Diego began pacing back and forth in the barn, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. But my real parents, Mr. Thompson, who were they? How did they die? Why has Maria been so afraid all these years that she couldn't even tell me the truth? Samuel sat down on a hay bale and gestured for Diego to do the same. Over the next hour, he told Diego everything Maria had shared with him about the wagon train attack, about Carlos Santos, and his obsession with finding treasure that probably never existed, and about the dangerous men who were now using Carlos to threaten their peaceful life at the ranch. So this Carlos thinks my dead parents hid money somewhere, and he's willing to hurt Maria and destroy our ranch to find it? Diego asked when Samuel finished the story. That's about the size of it, Samuel confirmed. But Diego, you need to understand something important. This isn't your fault, and it's not really about you. This is about a desperate, dangerous man who's made bad choices his whole life and now wants to blame everyone else for his problems. Diego was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had learned. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and determined. What are we going to do about it? Samuel smiled grimly at the word we. Despite everything Diego had just learned, his first instinct was to stand and fight alongside the people who had raised him. That told Samuel everything he needed to know about the kind of man Diego had become. First, we're going to make sure everyone on this ranch knows what kind of trouble might be coming. I won't have Carlos and his friends catching any of our people off guard. Second, we're going to send word to Sheriff Martinez in town and let him know we might need help. Third, we're going to make this ranch as defensible as possible without looking like we're preparing for war. Over the next week, Samuel put his plan into action. He quietly spoke with each of his ranch hands, explaining that dangerous men might be coming to threaten the ranch and that everyone needed to be extra vigilant. Most of the cowboys had been with Samuel for years, and their loyalty to him and the ranch was absolute. They began carrying sidearms more regularly and keeping rifles closer to their work areas. Maria was torn between relief that her secret was finally out and terror about what Carlos might do when he arrived. She had started jumping at every unexpected sound, and Samuel noticed that she rarely left the main house anymore. Diego was struggling with his own emotions, alternating between anger at the lies he had been told and protective fury toward anyone who would threaten Maria. The ranch's normal rhythm continued on the surface, but underneath there was a tension that everyone could feel. Cattle still needed to be moved to winter pastures, horses still needed to be trained and fed, and the daily work of running a successful ranch continued. But now everything was done with one eye watching the horizon for riders who didn't belong. Sheriff Martinez rode out to the ranch on the 5th day after Samuel's message reached town. He was a practical man in his 50s who had known Samuel for 15 years and respected him as one of the most honest ranchers in the territory. After hearing the full story about Carlos Santos and his threats, the sheriff agreed to have his deputies make more frequent patrols near the ranch, but he warned Samuel that his resources were limited. I can't station men here permanently, Sheriff Martinez explained as they stood on Samuel's porch. But if you send word that Santos has actually shown up and is causing trouble, I'll get here as fast as I can with every deputy I have. Just remember, Samuel, don't let pride make you wait too long to ask for help. Men like this, Carlos, sound like they won't hesitate to kill if they think it will get them what they want. On the 8th day, Samuel's preparations were put to the test. Young Billy Hawkins, who was watching the cattle in the north pasture, came riding hard toward the main house with news that made everyone's blood run cold. He had spotted 5 riders approaching the ranch from the east, and they weren't moving like men who had honest business in mind. Samuel gathered his most trusted hands around him. Diego, Tom Bradley, the head cook, Frank Morrison, who had been with the ranch since its beginning, and 3 other cowboys whose courage and loyalty had been proven over years of hard work. He sent Billy to ride to town with a message for Sheriff Martinez, then turned his attention to preparing for Carlos Santos's arrival. "Remember," Samuel told his men as they checked their weapons one final time, "we don't start anything, but we don't back down either. These men are counting on us being scared and weak. They're about to learn they made a serious mistake." Maria stood at the window of the main house, watching the eastern horizon where dust clouds marked the approach of the riders. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe, but she felt a strange sense of relief that the waiting was finally over. Whatever happened next, at least the terrible uncertainty would end. Diego took his position near the barn where he would have a clear view of the main yard, but also cover if shooting started. His rifle was loaded and ready, and his resolve was absolute. These men had terrorized Maria for years, and now they were threatening the only home he had ever known. Whatever the truth about his birth parents might be, his loyalty belonged to the people who had raised him and the ranch that had shaped him into the man he had become. The 5 riders appeared over the rise just before noon, moving at a steady pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. Samuel could see immediately that these were not ordinary cowboys or traveling ranchers. They rode like men who were comfortable with violence, and they approached his ranch like they already owned it. Carlos Santos was easy to identify, even at a distance. He was a large man with a black beard and clothing that was too fancy for honest ranch work. The men with him were clearly hired guns, the kind of outlaws who sold their skills to anyone with enough money to pay for intimidation and violence. Samuel stepped out onto his porch and waited, his hand resting casually on the grip of his pistol. Tom Bradley and Frank Morrison positioned themselves at the corners of the main house, while the other cowboys spread out to cover the yard from different angles. Diego remained near the barn, his rifle ready but not yet raised. When the riders were still 50 yards away, Carlos Santos raised his hand and called out in a voice that carried easily across the ranch yard. "Samuel Thompson, I presume. My name is Carlos Santos, and I believe you have something that belongs to me." Samuel remained silent, studying the 5 men as they drew closer. Carlos was clearly the leader, but the 4 men with him looked like professionals. This wasn't going to be as simple as facing down a desperate gambler and a few local troublemakers. Carlos continued speaking as the riders approached. "I'm here for my nephew, Diego Santos. His mother had no right to take him away from his family, and it's time for him to come home where he belongs." "This is his home," Samuel replied calmly when the riders were close enough for normal conversation. "And Maria Santos is his mother in every way that matters. You're not welcome on my ranch, Carlos. Turn around and ride away while you still can." Carlos laughed, a harsh sound that seemed to echo across the yard. "I don't think you understand the situation, Mr. Thompson. I have friends in Wyoming who are very interested in collecting a debt from me. If I don't pay them soon, they're going to start taking what they want from anyone connected to me. That includes my dear sister Maria and her boy Diego." The threat was clear, and Samuel felt his anger building like a fire in his chest. But he kept his voice level and his movements calm. "The only situation I see here is 5 men who are trespassing on my land and making threats against my family. You have 10 seconds to start riding away, or we're going to have a problem." Carlos's expression darkened, and his hand moved toward his gun. I don't think you realize how serious this is, Thompson. These men with me aren't ordinary cowboys. They're professionals, and they've dealt with stubborn ranchers before. All we want is the boy and any information about his real family's money. Give us that and nobody has to get hurt." 5 seconds, Samuel said quietly, and every man in the ranch yard could hear the finality in his voice. That was when Carlos Santos made the mistake that would change everything. Instead of recognizing that he was outnumbered and outgunned by men fighting for their home, he decided to try intimidation one more time. He drew his pistol and pointed it directly at Samuel Thompson. The ranch yard exploded into action as 6 different guns spoke almost simultaneously. The gunfight lasted less than 30 seconds, but those moments changed everything at the Thompson Ranch forever. When the smoke cleared and the echoing gunshots faded across the Montana landscape, 3 of Carlos Santos's hired guns lay dead in the ranch yard. One was wounded and surrendering, and Carlos himself was clutching his shoulder, where Samuel's bullet had shattered his collarbone. Samuel stood on his porch with his smoking pistol still in his hand, surveying the scene with grim satisfaction. Not one of his men had been seriously hurt, though Tom Bradley was nursing a graze on his arm and Frank Morrison's hat had acquired a bullet hole that he would joke about for years to come. Diego emerged from behind the barn, his rifle still ready, his face pale but determined. Carlos Santos was sitting in the dirt, leaning against his dead horse and looking up at Samuel with a mixture of pain and disbelief. The fancy clothes that had marked him as a man of means were now torn and bloody, and his arrogant confidence had been replaced by the desperate fear of a cornered animal. "This isn't over, Thompson," Carlos gasped through gritted teeth. "You have no idea what kind of people you're dealing with. When word gets back to Wyoming about this, they'll send more men. They'll burn this whole ranch to the ground." Samuel walked down from his porch and stood over Carlos, his expression cold and hard. "Carlos, you made the mistake of thinking that decent people are weak people. You thought you could ride onto my land, threaten my family, and intimidate men who have worked their whole lives to build something good. You were wrong." Diego approached cautiously, his rifle lowered but still ready for trouble. This was the man who had terrorized Maria for years, who had forced them to live in fear and secrecy. Looking at Carlos now, bleeding and defeated in the ranch yard, Diego felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing the threat finally ended, but also sadness for all the years of fear that had been wasted. Maria appeared in the doorway of the main house, her face white with shock, but her eyes bright with relief. For the first time in 25 years, she was looking at her brother Carlos without feeling the cold grip of fear in her stomach. He looked smaller somehow, less threatening, like the childhood bully he had always been rather than the dangerous outlaw she had built him up to be in her mind. Sheriff Martinez arrived with 3 deputies just as Samuel's men were tying up the wounded survivor and preparing to bury the dead. The sheriff surveyed the scene quickly, taking in the defensive positions of Samuel's men, the aggressive placement of the dead outlaw's horses, and the obvious evidence of who had started the trouble. "Looks like they drew first," Sheriff Martinez observed, holstering his own weapon. "Carlos pulled his gun and pointed it at Mr. Thompson," Tom Bradley confirmed. "We all saw it clear as day. They came here looking for trouble and they found more than they bargained for." The sheriff nodded and turned his attention to Carlos, who was now being bandaged by one of the deputies. "Carlos Santos, you're under arrest for trespassing, making terroristic threats, and attempted assault with a deadly weapon. When you're healed up enough to travel, you'll be going to trial in the territorial court." Carlos looked up at the sheriff with desperate eyes. "You don't understand, Martinez. There are men in Wyoming who will kill me if I don't pay them what I owe. They'll come looking for me here, and when they don't find me, they'll take it out on these people." Sheriff Martinez knelt down next to Carlos and spoke quietly but firmly. "Then I suggest you think real hard about cooperating with the law. Give me names and descriptions of these Wyoming outlaws, and maybe we can arrange some protection for you in exchange for your testimony. Keep making threats and trying to intimidate honest people, and you'll face whatever comes to you alone. Over the next hour, as the bodies were removed and statements were taken, Carlos Santos told Sheriff Martinez everything he knew about the Wyoming gang that had been pressuring him. It turned out that they were wanted for cattle rustling and bank robbery across 3 territories, and the information Carlos provided would eventually help law enforcement break up the entire organization. As the sun began to set, Samuel found himself alone on his porch with Maria and Diego, finally able to have the conversation that had been years in the making. The immediate danger was over, but the emotional aftermath was just beginning for all of them. "I'm sorry I lied to you for so long," Maria said to Diego, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I was so afraid of losing you, afraid that if you knew the truth you might want to leave and try to find out about your birth parents. This ranch, this family, it's all I've had since your father died." Diego was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the land he had always called home. The cattle were settling down for the night. The horses were nickering softly in their corrals, and the familiar sounds and smells of ranch life surrounded them like a comforting embrace. "Maria," he said finally, "you are my mother, not because of blood, but because of love. Because you saved me, raised me, and protected me every day of my life. The people who gave birth to me died when I was too young to remember them, but you're the one who taught me to walk and ride and be a man." Maria sobbed with relief, and Diego put his arms around her, holding her close while she cried out 25 years of fear and worry. Samuel watched them with his own eyes moist, thinking about how close they had all come to losing everything that mattered most. "What about my birth parents?" Diego asked when Maria had composed herself. "Do you think we'll ever know who they really were?" Samuel pulled out a small wooden box that he had retrieved from his safe earlier in the day. "Actually, we might know more than you think. When Sheriff Martinez was questioning Carlos, he mentioned something about a burned wagon train near the Mexican border 25 years ago. I sent a wire to a friend of mine who works for the territorial government, and he found some records." Samuel opened the box to reveal a small gold locket, a man's pocket watch, and a folded piece of paper. "These were found at the scene of the attack. The locket has a picture of a woman who looks remarkably like you, Diego. The watch is engraved, 'To Jonathan, with love, Sarah.' And this paper is a partially burned letter addressed to Jonathan and Sarah Caldwell." Diego took the locket with trembling hands and opened it to reveal a small photograph of a beautiful dark-haired woman who shared his eyes and the shape of his face. The resemblance was unmistakable, and for the first time in his life, Diego was looking at the face of his birth mother. "The Caldwells were traveling from Texas to California," Samuel continued. "According to the records, Jonathan was a successful merchant, and they were carrying their life savings to start a new business in San Francisco. The Apache attack left no survivors except for one baby who was never found. Until now." Diego stared at the photograph for a long time, trying to imagine the people who had given him life, but whom he would never know. "Do you think Carlos was right about hidden treasure?" Samuel shook his head. "The records show that the Caldwell's wagon was thoroughly looted. Whatever money they were carrying was taken by the raiders. Carlos spent his whole life chasing a fantasy, and it nearly destroyed everyone around him." Maria looked at the locket and the watch, finally understanding the full story of the day that had changed her life forever. "I always wondered if we should have tried harder to find your family, Diego. But we were so far from any town and there was no one to ask. We just did the best we could." "You did everything right," Diego assured her. "You saved a baby's life and gave him a family and a home. Jonathan and Sarah Caldwell would be grateful to know that their son was raised by people who loved him." As the stars came out over the Montana ranch, the three of them sat together in comfortable silence, each processing the events of the day in their own way. The threat that had haunted Maria for years was finally gone. Diego had learned the truth about his origins without losing the family that had raised him, and Samuel had protected the people and the land he cared about most. 2 weeks later, they received word that Carlos Santos had died of infection from his bullet wound while awaiting trial. The Wyoming gang he had been involved with was broken up by a combined effort of law enforcement from 3 territories, and the threat to the ranch died with them. Maria finally felt truly free for the first time in decades. Diego decided to keep the Caldwell name as part of his own, becoming Diego Caldwell Santos to honor both the parents who had given him life and the mother who had raised him. He continued working as Samuel's foreman, and over time, Samuel began teaching him everything about running a successful ranch operation. Years later, when Samuel was ready to slow down, Diego would take over the Thompson Ranch, eventually renaming it the Caldwell Santos Spread in honor of all the families that had shaped his life. Maria lived to see her son become one of the most respected ranchers in Montana, and she never again had to look over her shoulder in fear. The story of the day Carlos Santos came calling became legendary among the ranch hands and neighboring spreads. It was told as a reminder that decent people don't have to live in fear of bullies and outlaws, and that standing up for family and home is always worth the risk. Samuel Thompson continued to run his ranch with the same honesty and integrity that had made him successful, but he never forgot the lesson that sometimes peaceful people have to be ready to fight for what they believe in. The ranch prospered under his leadership, and when he finally passed away many years later, Diego spoke at his funeral about the man who had given him not just a job, but a father's love and guidance. The small wooden box with the Caldwell family items was passed down through Diego's children and grandchildren, a reminder of where they had come from and the courage it had taken for Maria Santos to save a baby's life all those years ago. The ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to the truth that real family is built through love and loyalty rather than just blood relations. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the Montana wind carries the scent of sage across the rangeland, visitors to the old Caldwell Santos spread can still hear stories about the day a desperate outlaw made the mistake of threatening the wrong family and learned that some things are worth fighting for no matter what the cost.